Okay, we are live on YouTube. And we'll wait till Geoff comes back to go live on Zoom. Hi, everybody on YouTube. All right, we'll go live on Zoom now.
Hey, found my dog.
Okay, so we're live everywhere. So people are going to start just pouring in now.
Great.
So if you want to, do you want to do any Burrowing Owl call entertainment pre-show?
Well, as we've talked about, the only call I really can even try to mimic is cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo. And that, of course, goes on incessantly through the spring as the male tries to attract a female. And then they have other calls like the rattlesnake call, which I can't mimic. I don't know if a human voice can even mimic it.
Do you want me to play that one?
Sure.
Let's see, I have to find it now again. Juvenile alarm call.
And that, of course, you only hear when you're right at the nest burrow and there are young inside trying to tell you to keep out. So they're trying to make it sound like there's a rattlesnake down there and you better not come visit. So you don't hear it from very far away. It's just a very localized call. And then
I
the
saw
other, sorry, go ahead.
spectrograms. I saw a spectrogram of that versus Dennis Martin. That's the person who did the Burrowing Owl paper, I think, on vocalizations. And I think he had a spectrogram of a rattlesnake rattle and this call from the juvenile burrowing owls, and it was like virtually indistinguishable. Can you tell them apart by ear or not?
Yeah, I can tell them. I mean, they sound different, although I'm probably biased because I'm either, well, actually, that's not true because I have encountered rattlesnakes in a burrowing owl burrow. But I think there's the rattlesnake call is a bit more sort of rattly, a bit more distinct calls. I mean, it's basically a bead rattling in a box, right? As opposed to something the vocal cords are doing. But usually the circumstances are different. You know, you're walking across the prairie and you hear the rattlesnake rattle, you know, it's a rattlesnake, not a burrowing owl. So.
Okay, and that cuckoo call, is that just the male that does it, or does the female do the cuckoo call also?
No, I think it's just the male. I'm just trying to think if I've heard females. I know I've had females follow me when I'm doing playback, but I don't ever remember her imitating the call. But it was quite a while ago, so I may have forgotten. So maybe somebody's going to disagree with me on the chat. Yep. And then the other call that you have there is the alarm call, which of course is something a researcher always likes to hear when they're surveying the prairie looking for burrowing owls. And when you hear the alarm call, it's like, oh, finally I found one. There's a nest somewhere nearby, and then the real search begins. But the alarm call.
Is that this one?
Yep. Yeah, so that call is whenever we go up to a burrowing owl nest, the male certainly always gives that call and call as well, presumably telling their mate that you know, there's trouble coming. I've actually wondered if there's a difference. I don't remember his last name now. His first name is Khan. He's got a long Russian name. He was a researcher on prairie dogs, and he was able to show that prairie dog calls are different for different predators approaching. So, a research question is the burrowing owl call, that alarm call, subtly different depending upon the type of predator that's coming, whether it's a mammal or a bird or even the kind of mammal.
Okay. Well, thanks for the intro on the calls. Do you want to jump into your presentation now?
Sure. Yep. If you think the audience is here, then let's go.
Looks like our numbers are fairly stable. We've given them a few minutes. Well, we just always have some that continue to roll in and go, oh my gosh, I forgot what time it was.
Yeah, I'm often one of those. I start setting my phone alarm to tell me 5 minutes before a webinar to avoid that. So you want me to share screen?
Yep. Should be good to go. Perfect.
There we go. Okay, so you want me to start in?
Yep, go for it.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Geoff Holroyd. I'm a retired research scientist with the Canadian Wildlife Service and currently chair of the Beaver Hill Bird Observatory. It's my pleasure today to summarize activities I've been involved in research over the last 25 to 30 years on burrowing owls and their decline in Canada, as I'm going to show you. The presentation is co-authored with my longtime collaborator, Helen Treffery, and a relatively new collaborator, Stefano from Grasslands National Park, who, as you'll see, has provided some key information on a solution to the conservation needs of burrowing owls on the Great Plains. So when one's looking at conservation, the question is, where did all the burrowing owls go and why? And most importantly, what can we do about it? But first, we have to figure out where did they go and why. So we have to be aware that burrowing owls are endangered in Canada. Their numbers declined over 95% in the 1990s, and they were already declared endangered prior to the 1990s. And so I think it was 85 or 75, I lost track of the year. Anyway, they've been endangered for a long time, and they've continued to decline over most of the Canadian prairies. Here's a couple of examples of the decline. A landowner program started by Nature Saskatchewan in 1987 had increases in the number of owls reported because the number of participants increased. But once the number of participants stabilized, then the number of owls reported declined dramatically, as you can see there, and has since never recovered. So now they're reporting somewhere around 10 pairs, whereas they used to report 1,100 pairs, a dramatic decline. And likewise, researchers on the Regina Plain, a series of graduate student studies showed declines. Paul James' study area was a smaller one. And when the other students, Troy Wallicom, Ray Pooling, Danielle Todd, came along, they actually had to increase the study area size to find enough owls to make a study. And as you can see, by 2011, they just gave up. It was just the number of owls are just so low that it's impossible to create a manageable study area in the Regina Plain. So what do we need to figure out to I've got this annoying, sorry, I've got a panel at the top that blocks my view of the picture. And so what do we need to do to figure out what's causing the decline? And an approach that we took is a simple one of looking at population modeling, which at the simplest form is how productive are the owls? How many young do they have? How many nests are successful? And then what's the survival? You've got the post-fledging mortality once they leave the nest and before they migrate. You've got mortality on migration. You've got mortality in the winter. Excuse me, and then mortality when they head back in the spring. But then a factor that is often overlooked is what portion of the owls are actually coming back to a given study area or a geographic area they're interested in, like Canada, and what portion of them are actually dispersing and going elsewhere. So they're not dead, but they're just not coming back to where they fledged or where they were breeding the previous year. So we're going to look into that quite a bit. Oops. So let's back up a little bit and show you what a burrowing owl looks like. A burrowing owl is a relatively small 150-gram owl that has been described as a pop can on stilts. They have relatively long legs, but are otherwise unremarkable in their coloring, fairly an interesting pattern, but brown, white, and fawn colors. And they nest in open grassland areas. Native prairie, there are some that nest in cultivated land, but not very commonly, mostly in native prairie areas. What do they eat? Well, we tried this owl. It wasn't very interested in the mouse, but in fact, their common prey are mice, voles, so rodents, small rodents, and insects, whether they're grasshoppers, crickets, and other terrestrial insects. There's a seasonality to their diet, and that's created a lively discussion among some researchers. Are they a rodent eater that has to eat insects once in a while, or are they an insectivore that's stuck eating rodents once in a while? And the discussion continues. The reality is they eat both. Where do they nest? Well, that's one of the unique things about burrowing owls. They nest in holes in the ground. On the native prairie, they are in holes of prairie dogs, where prairie dogs occur. And where there are no prairie dogs, then they use other abandoned burrows from mammals such as foxes, coyotes, badgers especially. The popular literature says they live in ground squirrel holes, ground squirrel burrows. The reality is a ground squirrel burrow is actually very small, maybe a 2-inch diameter, and they require at least a 4-inch diameter. However, a hole in the ground on the prairies is a resource that's used by many organisms over and over again. So when a ground squirrel digs a hole in the ground and lives there, a badger can come along and excavate the ground squirrel, leaving a bigger hole behind. Likewise with prairie dogs or coyotes. Over time, those burrows will start to collapse. A burrowing owl is capable of digging out the loose material and opening up a burrow if it's starting to collapse, but they cannot start on the native prairie and just dig a hole right from scratch. And so they actually have a bit of a love-hate relationship with badgers, as shown in these camera trap pictures. Here's a pair of burrowing owls looking concerned, looking down where their burrow entrance is. A badger pops up, and then this very brave male decides to try and discourage the badger. The reality is the badger had already eaten all the young, and that nesting attempt failed. So let's look at their productivity. On average, they lay 9 eggs. They have been known to lay up to a dozen, and obviously sometimes lay fewer than that. But in fact, only half or less of those young fledge. So within the 6 weeks from hatch to fledging, only 3 to 4 young survive per nest attempt. So here's a couple of graphs showing that in Grasslands National Park, where Helen Treffery and I first surveyed them in 1998. Over, I think it's about 22 years there. Their average was 2.9 young per successful nest. So very small number of young considering they're laying 9 eggs. Likewise, another study by Joe Schmutz in the Hanna area of Alberta, the average was 3.5 young, and that was somewhat exaggerated by the peak year in 1997, where they produced over 7 young. So that year is worth noting in that in the winter of 96-97, we had early and deep snow on the prairies that allowed meadow voles to breed under the snow where it was relatively warm. Early snow means the ground doesn't freeze very hard and the vegetation is cured. And then the deep snow means it stays warm under there. So the meadow voles breed. And in the spring, there were meadow voles everywhere. And so consequently, the burrowing owls had a bumper year of young with over 7 young per nest attempt. So if we break down the natural history parameters, the parameters, then we've got high nest mortality. So again, I'm summarizing a variety of studies here for you. Of 25% of nests fail. They're usually preyed upon by badgers or other mammals, or the adults are taken by falcons or other great horned owls, other predators. We have low productivity. From 9 eggs, we're getting 3 to 3.5 young, sometimes even less. In other studies, graduate student studies that we had during the 2000s, hatch year post-fledging mortality. So these are nestlings from when they leave the nest to when they head south is about 39%. So that's moderately high, but it was very low in the summer of 97 when there was lots of voles and presumably predators were eating other things other than small burrowing owls. One of the real unknowns in the burrowing owl field is recruitment. So the recruitment of nestlings from one year to the next, these are banded birds, is only 6%. So we call that apparent natal recruitment, and it's apparent because we really don't know how many of those young are coming back. We only know that portion that are coming back to a given study area, but it's very low. And that leaves about 55% of the owls doing something that we don't know anything about. So they could die on migration, there could be winter mortality, or they could be dispersing. So that's the other side of the natal recruitment. They're alive, they just went somewhere else and didn't come back to a study area. And for adults, it's somewhat similar. Study of adult post-fledging mortality in Alberta by Darcy Sherry showed that there was 7% mortality, relatively low, much lower than the hatch year nestling mortality. Apparent adult annual survival is 20% for on average. So males are twice as likely to come back to a study area than females. What we don't know is how many are coming back, but somewhere else they're dispersing. We don't know their migration mortality or their overwinter mortality. So we're going to explore that through a lot of the rest of the talk. So the question when I started studying burrowing owls most seriously around 1997 is, where do they go for the winter? Well, we asked our captive owl where it would like to go, but it seemed uninterested, or at least not to recognize the globe, and was more interested in getting a mouse, which I showed you earlier. So we put the owl in charge of driving the vehicle. That ended up in a few near misses in the ditches. So we decided that wasn't a good idea to let the owl show us where it wanted to go for the winter. So we got a bit more technical about it. We looked at band recoveries, and there's a bunch of band recoveries from Saskatchewan and Manitoba and the central prairies there, or northern prairies of Canada. And they're all into the southern US, Louisiana and Texas in the winter. There was one interesting recovery from Oklahoma down into central Mexico. And I would have to say, when you get a first data point, assume that it's close to the median and not an outlier. So the band recoveries from Canada that are there, most of them are in the fall, or a couple are in the spring, but they're not in the deep winter. The one from Oklahoma to central Mexico was in the winter. We then got another clue, excuse me, from this banded bird that was found in the Rio Grande Valley and photographed, and the photo shows the band says band wash, which is obviously a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service band, 819. And Troy Wallicom, one of my graduate students, banded an owl 81919, and on the leg of this owl, if you can see my pointer, it's not really obvious, there's a double red band, and he put 81919 on a male in the Regina Plain and double banded it with red bands. So taking that as a cue, I decided I should go further south and hooked up with Ricardo Rodriguez, who studied burrowing owls on the Mapimi Biosphere Reserve at the southern end of the Chihuahuan Desert. He studied them during the breeding season, and he understood they stayed there for the winter. So we met up at Mapimi and hiked through the area for 2 weeks. A lot of it is a cactus desert. but there are grasslands, which tends to be where the owls were in breeding season. They're in burrows from kangaroo rats and other fossorial mammals, nesting in these flat areas. In order to do this field work, I rented a VW Combi, which turned out not to be a great vehicle. The tires were not very good, and it wasn't long before we had a flat tire. I took extra spares with me from the rental agency. Before long, we had 3 flat tires. This annoyed us a great deal, and we probably shouldn't have done this, but what the heck. However, then we realized that we didn't have a lot of water, and we were 15 kilometers from the research station. So it wasn't long before vultures were circling, and you can guess what happened. Of course, there's supposed to be laughter at this point, so I hope some of you are smiling. This is the reality of what it felt like after walking 15 kilometers in the heat with virtually no water. We were parched, our feet were boiling, and we made sure in the future we always had a couple of gallons of water in a container in the back of the vehicle once we get all the flat tires fixed. The end result, however, was that we did not find any owls wintering in the Mapimi Biosphere Reserve. A couple of landowners said they'd seen them recently, but we were unable to confirm them. So clearly most of the owls, if not all of the owls that breed in Mapimi, go somewhere else. So then we got a bit more technical. Some of the studies I mentioned earlier looking at survival in Canada were done through VHF telemetry. So we put slightly heavier batteries on the VHF transmitters on the owls in the summer and then went to follow them in the winter. We hired Tom Taylor and his Cessna aircraft to fly transects looking for the transmitters over Texas and Mexico. We flew transects every 50 kilometers from Houston, Texas to Guadalajara, Mexico, along the coastal plain and then into the interior down the Bajío or the Lerma River Valley. And we got some hits. We also discovered a lot of the coastal plain is cultivated for a variety of agricultural crops. We narrowly missed this volcano. We were the last plane to take off from Puebla. When we turned to do the next transect, we looked back and there was this great plume as the volcano had blown up right behind us, and the airport was closed and the town covered in volcanic ash. We had lots of other exciting moments, but I can't relate all of them because that would take the rest of the talk. Anyway, we did have some hits. One was an owl that was wintering under these annual vegetation, these weeds, if you like, in this uncultivated field. Didn't seem like a very good place to spend the winter, but when we returned a year later, this is the same field had been turned into a subdivision. So we saw habitat loss in the winter firsthand with this one example. Another owl was found dead in this orange orchard in Veracruz. There were roadside hawks in the area, and we suspect that roadside hawks got their talons into this owl. We retrieved the transmitter and some feathers and the bands, but the owl was gone by then. I should also mention, whenever we were doing research in Texas and Mexico, we always hooked up with local people, and especially important in Mexico when we're going into a lot of rural areas. Our co-workers were very capable at introducing us to the landowners, making sure that we weren't doing anything that was unpopular. And then another owl that we found was in this thorn scrub cactus patch in Michoacan. This was a relatively small patch of vegetation surrounded by cornfields. And what we discovered by following this owl was that it went out into the cornfields at night and then came back into the cactus patch in the daytime. So we did the telemetry at the end of the year, November, early December, and then returned by vehicle in January, February to actually visit these sites and find out what the owls were doing. So we had 4 recoveries, if you like, of owls, 2 in Texas and 2 in Mexico. At the same time, we'd done a lot of driving throughout Mexico looking for wintering owls and trapping them. So then my managers were wondering what I was doing every winter, heading down to Mexico, avoiding the winters in Alberta, which can be severe. So I had to prove that I was studying owls that actually came from Canada. So Jason Duxbury started a PhD study with me. looking at stable isotopes in burrowing owls and peregrines, but we're only talking about burrowing owls today. So the idea here is getting a feather from an owl that obviously has stable isotopes from its food, which are the mice and insects from the grasslands, running them through a mass spectrometer, looking at the ratio of carbon, nitrogen, and hydrogen, and then putting them on a map and comparing them to both the water gradient that's there for hydrogen, as well as carbon and nitrogen. And so the idea is to delineate. So we also delineated isotope populations by getting researchers to send us feathers from nestlings. So these were feathers grown at a known location that would have the stable isotope signature from that location. And that allowed Jason to modify the generic maps for these isotopes. And what we're able to show is that quite a few of the owls that we were catching in South Texas and in Mexico came from Alberta and Saskatchewan. And as a test of the technique, the purple line there to Veracruz was the owl that we found dead. So we gave the feather to Jason, not telling him where it was from or that we actually knew it was from the Regina Plain. And his stable isotope map plunked it right in the middle of the Regina Plain. So that was only one sample to prove the technique. But obviously we had lots of connections between Alberta and Saskatchewan. So we established two study areas, one at the end of all the green lines here near Irapuato, a little town called Valencianita, and the other where the red line is on the outskirts of Guadalajara at the Zapopan Air Force Base. We also tried tracking them using geolocators. So geolocators record light level and time, and from that one can interpret sunrise, sunset, and day length, and then use that to geolocate where a bird was based on sunrise, sunset, and day length. So this owl, we put the transmitter, the geolocator on in southern Alberta, and you can see the track there through the western states. The interesting part was that it, even after it left Alberta, it then stopped for a month in Montana, then continued down, spent a month in South Texas, and then moved again for the winter. And unfortunately, the geolocator stopped working on December 24th that year. However, it came back to Alberta and we were able to retrieve it. On the other side of the coin, we actually put a total of 14 loggers on and only one came back. So the question is, did the other 13 die or did they disperse somewhere else? As I'm about to show you, we think they dispersed somewhere else, and geolocators are not a good technique to use for burrowing owls because of their high dispersal. So a way to get around that is to put satellite transmitters on, and finally satellite transmitters became small enough that we could deploy them on burrowing owls, and we had some great tracks. This was a very interesting, important one, our first one. The owl went down to New Mexico and stayed for a long time in the north, as you can see on the Alberta-Montana border till middle of October, then went south, and then very curiously made a sharp right turn and ended up in Baja. And we actually visited there and hooked up with a local veterinarian who was very interested in the burrowing owls that came there in the winter. So this area, you can see from the center of the slide, is the largest salt dehydration plant in the world. So it creates salt for industrial purposes, and the owl was on the far side of it. Fortunately, the veterinarian had a permit to go into that industrial area and was able to take us in. And this is the kind of bleak habitat the owl was in. However, there were kestrels there and shrikes, and we also saw lizards, small snakes, potential prey items. So even though there were lusher habitats nearby close to the ocean, in those areas there were peregrine falcons and other large predators. So we think the owl was doing a trade-off between finding enough food for the winter and avoiding predators by staying in this desert-like habitat. We put more satellite transmitters on, and they went down to central Mexico, which is what we had started to conclude from our stable isotope studies. And you can see the tracks there. And all of our tracks showed the birds were headed to the central Mexico, the Bajío, which is the Lerma River. So if you're not familiar with the geography of Mexico, there's a river that starts on the west side of the mountains in Veracruz and flows all the way across and comes out into the Pacific north of Puerto Vallarta. So it goes past Puebla, Mexico City, and Guadalajara. This was the sort of breadbasket of ancient Mexico, and that's where the owls, a lot of our owls, are going for the winter. So we spent about 10 winters there studying owls, searching for them. We found they are not necessarily in open grasslands like they are in the breeding season in North America, but in fact, they will roost in a whole host of different kinds of habitats, including shrublands, arroyos, and the likes. The gentleman on the upper right with the black hat on shot owls for the national museums in the US on this slope. And he said he always found owls roosting around the base of these shrubs and trees. But in fact, when he took us to the area, his comment was, I don't know where they've all gone, but this is where they used to be. So you can see that he was very adamant that something had happened. They'd obviously declined. So we ended up with a study area near this little village of Valencianita. The slopes above Valencianita had been overgrazed, and the Mexican Environmental Authority had plowed with a big cultivator, plowed up the rocks to create furrows and then planted shrubs on the slope. And those rocks, like on the upper right, big plates of sedimentary rocks, created artificial burrows. And we found over 40 owls roosting in these areas in the winter. So we trapped them, put transmitters on them, and worked with Enrique Valdez, who received his PhD a few years ago from our winter studies. Here he's in our second study area, the Air Force base outside of Guadalajara at Zapopan, trapped owls there using bow nets, put transmitters on them, and then followed them through the winter to look at their foraging habitat, but also what was their survival. Were they all dying in the winter, which is what the hypothesis was in Canada because of the low return rates. You remember only 5% of the young returned, only 20% of the adults returned. What we found from the foraging habitat part of the study was that the lowlands adjacent to the slopes and outside the Air Force Base had agricultural crops that tend to be left standing through the winter until the farmer needed the crop. And so you can see here, the crop is still there. One can imagine there's lots of food for mice and insects. And then once the crop is cultivated, then there's a stubble left, and all these mice and insects are instantly available to the burrowing owls. And that is in fact what we found. After a field was cultivated, the next night, the owls would switch their foraging location to the cultivated fields. And in those areas, the bulk of their diet were grasshoppers, insects of various kinds, and to some extent, rodents. Rodents became more important after the Christmas New Year. There was typically a frost in the area that we assumed depressed the insect population. And then after Christmas, the bulk of the diet was switched over to small mammals. We also found some dead. So part of our objective is to look at the overwinter survival and mortality. We found them killed by various predators. Barn owl and short-eared owl were suspected in a couple of instances, and being buried by a bulldozer was the consequence of an owl burrowing in a hole on a golf course under redevelopment. So that was a sad Sunday when Enrique wrote to me and said he'd found one buried underground. While we were doing this, we also talked to the local inhabitants, especially the children. We wanted the people in Valencianita in particular to know what we were doing. And we ended up with a very good relationship. Enrique created this upper left triptych, a three-panel handout pamphlet to give people with a story about conserving burrowing owls and why. On the bottom left are our ratineers, So these were young boys. They attend school half a day in Mexico and then are free for half the day. And we found them wandering the slopes with slingshots, shooting at any and everything. So we talked to them. They were very accommodating. They stopped shooting birds. They agreed they would shoot for more stationary targets. And then we asked them, where could we get some mice? We needed some dead mice to bait our traps. And they all simultaneously said, in our kitchens. So we went into town, bought every mouse snap trap that we could, gave each child 2 each, and the next morning they all returned with 4 mice. We gave them the equivalent of 25 cents a mice. So every day they were earning $1 a day, bringing us more nice mice than we could ever use. But we felt we were also having a small public health benefit. And of course, we left them the traps when we left. We also talked to the older students, the high school students, the bottom right, in the town. And afterwards, the teacher, oops, I guess I don't have that there, sorry. The teacher said we should do more. And in fact, we ended up using the students to survey with us. So the middle slide there are those high school students helping us survey that slope, counting the owls. They got so good at counting the owls, recording the location, collecting pellets, that they actually started doing it on months when we couldn't get there. So we ended up with a monthly sample thanks to the high school students in that school. We also had obviously more adventures traveling around Mexico in the winter. And one of the more dramatic was surviving the earthquake in Colima. We were not in this building that collapsed, but we did run out into the streets to get out of the way. In contrast, we found the habitats in Texas were much bleaker. They were in the cultivated cotton fields, living in small drain pipes and foraging in very minimal vegetated areas that were left outside of the edges of the cultivated fields. So what did we find? I'll skip through the numbers. The overall mean overwinter survival was 75%. So we estimated that 24% of the owls died in the winter over a 6-month period, and 76% survived. So clearly that's nowhere near the mortality that was demonstrated in the year-to-year apparent survival rates. Far more are surviving the winter. So what happens in the spring? This is where the story gets quite interesting. So again, we use stable isotopes. When the owls return in the spring, we caught them and took feather samples. So those feathers are now a year old. They were grown the previous year, and that gives us an indication of where were they the previous year compared to where they are now. So we know they went south. They did not grow, they grow body feathers down there, but not tail feathers or flight feathers. And we collected a tail feather. They come back. So what is the dispersal distance between where they were the previous year and subsequent year? And we found the mean dispersal distance from one year to the next was 400 kilometers. So roughly a third of the owls return to within 250 kilometers of where they were the previous year. And that's about the accuracy of the stable isotope measure. It's not pinpointing, it's not GPS accurate. But you can see the frequency of owls, the dispersal distances. 2 of them had dispersed from Mexico the previous year. So we believe that at least 2 of those owls grew their feathers in Mexico the previous year and were breeding in Canada in the subsequent year. So huge dispersal from one year to the next. So more, and then Jason also looked at the number of owls breeding in the US that were in Canada in the previous year. So the owls go south, they come back, but if they have a 400-kilometer short stop on average, then how many of them are coming back stopping in the US versus coming back to Canada, and how many bred in the US the previous year and are coming back to Canada? So what is the net difference? And he estimated a net loss of 20% per year. So 20% more owls are staying in the US that were in Canada the previous year than vice versa. So a potential factor causing the decline of owls of 20% per year. And our first satellite transmitter, you remember I mentioned the owl that went to Baja for the winter? Well, it was perfect for us. It started moving in early April, flew up the Pacific coast of Baja, and then crossed the mountains from April 11th to 16th, 350 kilometers a day to Denver, made the short hop up to Fort Collins, and then stayed there and bred there. So it short stopped 1,000 kilometers from where it successfully bred the previous year in southern Alberta. A dramatic example of short stopping that the stable isotope predicted these owls would do. Subsequently, we had other owls with satellite transmitters that short stopped, but not as far. One short stopped into Montana, and one moved more east-west into the Govenlock and Reno PFRA pastures. These are agricultural pastures along the Montana border. So those owls had more of an east-west movement, but were still outside of our study area. We would not have detected them by using banding alone. I'll just skip that one. So a dramatic example of dispersal in this owl, which we published in Raptor Research a few years ago, was this owl here. So this owl was banded in Arizona in April 2003 by Courtney Conway's staff. She was in a burrow with a brood patch, with a male, with at least one young. We trapped her the same year on July 7th in a burrow with a male and 7 young in southern Saskatchewan. So this was a dispersal within the same year, a renest of 1,850 kilometers. So she went south. We don't know if she wintered in Arizona or further south, bred in Arizona with one male, and then moved 1,800 kilometers to southern Saskatchewan. So if anybody says these owls don't disperse, this is a dramatic example within the same year. So let's go back to our numbers here, and apologies to those of you that are not necessarily technically minded, but bear with me. So we'll go back through our numbers. And if you remember, we got down to overwinter, apparent natal recruitment was only 6%. We now know overwinter mortality was 24%. We were not able to distinguish the hatch year, second year birds from older than that. We now have a technique, but unfortunately, that study's over. With a dispersal figure from Jason of 20%, then that leaves about 11% as a migration left over, but not a huge mortality figure. So we're now adding to apparent natal recruitment 20% that actually are alive but dispersed elsewhere. And likewise for adults, overwinter mortality of 24%, dispersal of 20%. So we've got now we've got an annual survival figure closer to 50%, and then migration is simply the leftover. We don't know what happens in migration. It's simply the leftover of getting to 100%. So we believe the proximal cause of the decline in Canada is the short stopping in the US. Birds are simply not crossing the border. They find vacant habitat in the US, but that is actually caused by low productivity of burrowing owls in Canada and in the US, certainly in the northern US, and that's the ultimate cause of the decline. The owls are simply not producing enough young to replace themselves from one year to the next. There's vacant habitat in the US, and owls coming north simply stop wherever they find suitable nesting habitat. So here we go back to a PhD thesis by Troy Wellicombe, one of my first graduate students. And he conducted this study in the Regina Plain. This is obviously just a couple of the highlights. And he looked at brood reduction in the nestling stage of burrowing owls. And you can see the dotted lines here. I think you can see my cursor. For example, 1993, after about 10 days, the number of owls surviving declines dramatically. In 1993, the same thing happened in 98, except the brood reduction happened almost immediately. If we look at 97, if you remember, that was the year when meadow voles were super abundant, then mortality didn't happen. So the other part of Troy's thesis research was to do feeding, supplemental feeding to a portion of the sample, and those are the dark black lines. So you can see that if he supplemental fed, that nestling mortality tended not to happen or was far less severe. Far more of the young survived if they had supplemental feeding. So a summary here is that in the first 3 weeks of the nestling's life, about half of them die. And with supplemental feeding, then a majority of those will survive. So then supplemental feeding involved feeding dead mice twice a week in the months of June and early July. So here's some data from Troy's study, and I'll just first explain that the two black bars is he supplemental fed before egg laying and found no difference between the number of eggs they laid when they were fed and not fed. But what he did find in some years was a dramatic increase in the number of young on years when they were fed. So the yellow lines are unfed pairs, the average brood size. And you can see in every year except 97, when there was a superabundance of migratories, there was an increase in the number of young surviving through supplemental feeding. So what's the solution? Produce more young through supplemental feeding. And Helen, Treffry, and I have been surveying the burrowing owls in Grasslands Park since 1998. And Stefano arrived there looking for projects in some ways, but also the park was looking at its management plans and agreed to undertake a supplemental feeding program building on the Troy's research. So the purpose was to increase the number of young that survived to fledging. They were fed 14 mice twice a week for about 6 weeks. There's some variables there, and this provides about 3 times the metabolic requirement of an adult owl. So it's not totally feeding the young in the nest, but providing a big supplementation. Here's one example of the difference between supplemented and unsupplemented nests. The ones that were fed in these 4 years had a mean of 6.3 young per successful nest, and the ones that were not fed had half the number of young, 3.3. And this is a graphic representation of, so the pinky orange lines are the number of young produced per successful nest since we started doing the surveys in '98. There was 2 years of supplemental feeding in 2011-12, and you can see the blue lines increasing the number of young produced where supplemental feeding occurred. And then likewise, since Stefano arrived and did this more intensively, Stefano's objective was to supplemental feed as many nests as we could find. And so you can see in 2017, there's no unfed sample because we simply found all of the nests in May and they were all supplemental fed. In some cases, we found some nests later in the season. They're either late nesters or ones that we missed, and they are the unfed sample. Up until 2021, the 2021 sample, he supplemental fed 25 pairs and did not supplemental feed the other 18 pairs. Simply a manpower and logistics difference. So there's a more of an even sample size. Otherwise, the sample sizes are uneven. But the bottom line of this graph is where they are fed, the years where they are fed, for the most part, they produced more young. You can see in 2020, there was no difference between them. That's probably a year like 1997, where there's an abundance of natural food. So supplemental feeding did not make a difference that 1 year. So this is a comparison of the number of the brood counts in fed and unfed nests. You can see the control versus fed, and there's significantly more young produced where they were fed. And then, although the objective wasn't necessarily to stabilize the population because of the high dispersal rate, in fact, what's happened in the last 2 years is the number of owls nesting in the 13 colonies that we survey in Grasslands Park increased dramatically to 33 pairs last year and well, I didn't write it down. I think it was 42 pairs in 2021. So this is likely a combination of the results of supplemental feeding and dispersal, simply owls coming back to Grasslands Park, coming to Grasslands Park from elsewhere. Interestingly, you can see in 2012, there was an increase compared to 2011 and compared to all the years from 2010 to 2019. And that was when that initial captive supplementation project occurred, just for 2 years. So there was actually an increase in the number of owls that year, but the bottom line is a dramatic increase in the last 2 years. So we believe this is further evidence that supplemental feeding will provide a solution to the decline in the number of burrowing owls. So what should we do? We should conserve habitat. Obviously, these owls need some habitat with burrows and food in them, and native prairie is the best way to do that. Unfortunately, more and more of the Canadian prairies are being cultivated. Pastures are being turned over for the first time. Remarkably, we're still cultivating native habitat. And then the solution is to produce more young through supplemental feeding to maintain the population where they are unable to produce enough young on their own. We also drafted a North American conservation plan because obviously the survival of these owls depends on not just what's happening in Canada, but in the United States and Mexico. This is one of the walls in the square in Valencianita. These are our high school students, and we were really pleased when we came back one November, and they had put their resources together, bought paint, and put this mural on the town wall promoting conservation together, if you don't know your Spanish. So that was really rewarding, but they got the message, and hopefully others will too. So we wrote a tri-national conservation action plan. It was published in 2005 by the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. However, the Commission doesn't have any real mandate to implement it. So the report sits there. I encourage you to go and look at it at the CEC website, cec.org. It has a variety of components that we still feel are important to work towards the conservation of the western burrowing owl. So in summary, the largest single mortality factor in the burrowing owl life cycle is the 50% loss of nestlings in the first 3 weeks. Supplemental feeding can save over half of these nestlings by feeding them dead mice twice a week. And we are hoping that this will result in a larger scale program to supplemental feed burrowing owls, and that could in fact reverse the decline. If one looks more rigorously at the population dynamics, we don't need to supplemental feed every nest in Western North America. We probably need to supplemental feed somewhere in the order of 10 or 20% of the owls to increase the number of young to maintain the population. So thank you to the landowners and land managers of native grasslands and their livestock, the cows, of course. We thank the recovery team members and all who have cooperated in these activities. One caution to any students that are listening: if you study something for too long, you can end up looking like them. And thank you for your interest.
Thank you very much, Geoff. And if you want to stop your screen share, then we will just jump into questions. And I realized I forgot to do the intro at the beginning. So thankfully you introduced yourselves.
No worries.
And thanks to everybody that's watching that made a donation to support this program also, because that's how we're able to keep everything free. So what probably most people don't see is the small army of people behind the scenes making this happen. So Joe and I will be asking Geoff questions now. We've got a crew over in YouTube. We have somebody on site at the Owl Center, and Joe has also been working behind the scenes on Facebook also to keep things running there. Okay, I think that's all I was supposed to say at the beginning. Joe, are you ready to jump in with a question?
Sure. We have a question about collecting eggs to incubate for the release of healthy fledged young.
Well, the adults are capable of incubating the eggs themselves. So we've no indication that that will benefit them. If you remember, the owls are nesting underground, so getting access to the eggs is problematic. In Troy Wallicom's study, he actually dug up nests when they were first, when the pairs first arrived, and put in an artificial chamber so he could access them to collect the data that I've shown you. But other than that, it's incredibly difficult to access the eggs. So and there's no obvious benefit to do that.
Oh, and Joe just posted the link for Beaver Hill Bird Observatory, where Geoff is the chair of the board of directors and apparently does anything and everything else that needs to get done there also, and he's been there for quite some time, retired from research. He was a research scientist for Environment Canada for a long time also, and as he mentioned, he did peregrine stuff. So if the folks over in YouTube want to post that Beaver Hill Bird Observatory link also, they've probably already done that. They're on the ball. Okay, so I will jump in with another question. So this person is from Venezuela, and they are wondering if GPS equipment is easily available or if somebody could donate one to help with work there.
Well, it'd be great to see it done. The transmitters are quite expensive. It's approaching 10 years since I last purchased one, but I think there were a couple of $1,000s US, and then it's about $1,200 US a year for the data, depending upon how long the transmitter lasts. So you're looking at $3,000 US per transmitter. So I don't know if anyone is willing to donate them. It'd be really interesting to see them studied more in South America. I don't have a clue whether they moved there or whether they're sedentary. I can imagine in Venezuela, most of the area, they're not likely to have the severe winters that we do in the Great Plains. So there'd be less need for them to move, but it would certainly be interesting to see them studied more.
And I think David Johnson is working with some crews in South America right now to look at the different populations and subspecies and vocalizations and morphology and stuff. So I think that's ongoing like right now.
And David has done satellite telemetry on them in Washington, Oregon, and worked with Courtney Conway in the US Great Plains. But whether David or anyone would have access to transmitters to put on owls in Venezuela, I don't know. Probably a first step I would recommend to someone in Venezuela is to color band them. I don't know what the banding schemes are in Venezuela, but put color bands on and see if in fact they're sedentary year round. Do you find the color banded birds stay there through the winter, or do they disappear? In which case you've got a migration, and that makes putting satellite transmitters on more worthwhile. If they're sedentary, then there's probably no real need to put transmitters on them.
Along with that, with the GPS trackers, someone says they're working with the little owl, studying dispersion and spatial use of reintroduced individuals. So far they use a VHF transmitter, but at some point tracked birds disappear, flying far from the release site, and they can't find them. So they're interested in trying GPS transmitters. Could you share some details of the transmitters you used in your research?
Yeah, so the geolocators I do not recommend. So the geolocators store information. They store light level and time, and you have to recover the geolocator to get anything from it. It does not transmit. And so if a bird's dispersing and you want to know where it dispersed to, you're not going to find it any more than you would if it had a bird band on it. So you should use satellite transmitters. They're readily available through, I believe, the company's Low-Tech. I think they've miniaturized them even more, and certainly I would recommend them. I attended a little owl symposium 10 or so years ago just outside of Barcelona and published a paper. I don't remember the name of the journal, but it's the Journal of the Barcelona Museum. So if the researcher wants to look that up. And there I recommended a parallel to what was happening in Canada. In fact, in Northern Europe, I believe the owls are migrating. The data I have that was shared by Hugo Framus and others in Spain showed an increase in the number of little owls in winter, which is in agreement with they're actually migrating out of Northern Europe. I suspect they're doing what burrowing owls do in the southern US, places like Albuquerque and Las Cruces in New Mexico, where the males tend to remain on territory, presumably guarding their burrows, and the females and the young leave. And without getting into it, I think that's what happens with a lot of saw-whet owls too. So I suspect, and that's what I hypothesize is happening with little owls. So certainly putting the satellite transmitters on would allow them to track those owls and find out if in fact they are migrating to Southern Europe and then coming back in the spring.
How do the transmitters survive going in and out of burrows?
And the antennae is quite flexible, and the transmitter is fairly low profile. So we never saw any issues with the transmitter. Obviously, it's not great. You still got this antennae flapping on your back. The first antennae that we used were too fine, and the owls were able to crimp them, turn them into curlicues. So they've got a slightly heavier antennae on them now, but still it flexes. I suspect the owl is aware of it. If it's moving in the burrow, then the antennae is going to be catching on the roof of the burrow. And it's probably a good point to remember that when we're putting attachments on birds, we should do it with every intent of using the information. We're asking this bird to do something for us, and it gets no reward. And so obviously we have to do our best. One of the things that bothers me about satellite transmitters, especially from Canada and the US, is we learn where all these birds are going into Central and Southern America, Central America and Southern America, but rarely do we connect with parties down there. So I'm glad you mentioned David Johnson working with folks in South America. In that case, the owls aren't going down there, but I know I've tracked peregrine falcons into Central and South America, and only once in a while by happenstance end up talking to anybody in those countries about what we learn. So I think one of the things that we need to do with transmitters is learn how to better share that data. I know there's a current project with the Audubon Society and others to create a migration atlas, which will start to do that. Anyway, that's an aside.
And I thought it was very smart of you to make sure that you were studying a species that was going to nice warm places in the winter also. That was very, very good foresight there.
Well, that came out of a recovery team meeting in the middle of winter in Regina, where the local researchers said these owls are going south. We don't know where they're going, and they're not coming back. Somebody's got to find out where they're going. So I literally half jokingly put up my hand and said, I'll find out, as the north wind blew outside the windows.
This question says, this is the first time I've heard of the isotope studies. Are other researchers using this technique?
Oh, yeah. So if a person Googles stable isotopes and migration, Keith Hobson is one of the pioneers. I forgot the name of the first researcher in New England that used this technique, but it's been used quite a lot on a whole host of species.
This question's popping over from YouTube. Are the population booms like 1997, do you know if they correlate with snowy owl eruptions? Because you were talking about, it was about there being a lot of food. Any correlation with snowy owls, because they seem to be about food to some degree.
Yeah, and that I haven't looked at. It'd be worth looking at and seeing. I mean, the snowy owls are coming out of the Arctic, so presumably their invasions are due to circumstances in the Arctic more than someone sending them an email saying, hey, there's lots of food down here, why don't you come join us? So my understanding of the current status of snowy owls is they leave the Arctic because they had a bumper year, not necessarily because they're running out of food. And then when they come down here, they may or may not find a lot of food, and some do well and some don't. So there's, sort of a 50-50 split there.
What do you suspect are the reasons the owls aren't finding enough rodents on their own? Poor choice of habitats, rodenticides, not enough rodent habitat?
Yeah, probably a bit of all of that. I think a key one is our insecticides. So we have basically destroyed the ecological variability on the prairies by a combination of insecticides, probably less so rodenticides, although they certainly are used to control ground squirrels and prairie dogs, which I suggest aren't needing to be controlled, but that's a whole extra topic. We've also, so one of the dramatic examples is on the Great Plains, there used to be a locust. So we see pictures of locusts swarming over Asia and Africa periodically. That used to happen in North America. And in fact, if one researches the history of the US Department of Agriculture, it's started by Congress asking researchers to find out how to solve the locust problems that were destroying crops of American farmers in the Midwest and West. And it ultimately grew into the Department of Agriculture. So the locust outbreaks were very severe. The last one occurred in 1902-03. It started in the Great Plains near Calgary, Alberta, and the locust ate everything green through to Winnipeg. So, you know, Minnesota, not far from where you guys are, north of you. And then the species disappeared. So there's a book called The Locust, and the hypothesis is that they were somewhat like passenger pigeons. They had these giant social networks that resulted in them breeding. And once that broke down, then the species simply collapsed and disappeared. So the locust, it's believed, laid eggs on bare soil. So historically, the bare soil would be bison wallows, and the eggs would hatch, and then they'd have vegetation nearby. Once we started cultivating the Great Plains, then there was lots of bare soil, but you've got a giant tract of bare soil with no food nearby. So whatever caterpillars do hatch simply starve in the bare field, and the species went extinct. So those grasshoppers, those locusts, would have been a boom for burrowing owls, for short-eared owls, for any number of prairie birds and other mammals that would have had boom years and bust years. So if you have boom years and bust years, you do well when there's a lot of food, you have a lot of young, you get for a burrowing owl 7+. When you have a bust year, you only get 2 or 3 young. But so long as you get some good years, then you can handle the population is sustainable. If the good years are less frequent, then the population starts to decline. And that's what we're seeing. So the 1997 boom year is not being replicated in any regular frequency. And so supplemental feeding will replace that. And likewise, all those insects would have caused outbreaks of rodents. So one of the first Canadian agricultural settlements on the prairies was in Winnipeg, Red River. And there's a lady that wrote a book called The First White Woman on the West. And she married a trapper and settled in the Red River. And she documents the first 5 years that they planted crops. And for 3 years, the locust ate everything. The 4th year, mice ate everything. And the 5th year, they finally had a crop and able to sustain themselves. And in the 4 years where they didn't grow a crop, they actually had expeditions down to your country, into Minnesota and Wisconsin, to buy seed, because they didn't even get enough seed to replant. So it was the colony almost collapsed, the human settlement, from mice and grasshoppers. So that was terrible for the settlers, but to a burrowing owl, that meant there were 4 good years and then 1 bad year. The reverse, obviously, of what the settlers thought. And that's simply not happening anymore.
Two paired together. Are burrowing owls in the US Great Plains declining? And what's the status of the Florida population? So, and if you could talk a little bit about the Florida ones versus the rest.
Sure. So in the West, they are declining. There was a status report done some years ago, and I forget my colleague in Wyoming, but anyway, he took the lead on it and determined they were declining, not enough to get listed. And then I don't know all the ins and outs of politics of getting endangered species listed in the US, but I gather it's pretty tough to do these days. So whether they deserve to be listed or not, I can't say. I've been out of touch for a while, but they were definitely declining over most of the US. There was one slide you might remember in my talk that I skipped over showing the abundance of burrowing owls based on breeding bird surveys. And the only place where they're super abundant is the Four Corners area of Colorado, what's underneath Oklahoma, Texas, and that sort of upper Great Plains area centered on Colorado. But otherwise, they're sparse, and the numbers have declined from all of the states that abut the Mississippi River. So they're only found in the western portion of those states like yours, whereas they used to be widespread in those provinces or those states. So the Florida population I know less about. I think they're doing somewhat better. I mentioned in my talk they don't dig their own burrows. I believe that's not true in Florida. I believe there's some records where they are able to dig burrows in shell fragments where they've got a dome of vegetation that will hold the top, and then they're able to dig it out. But I also know from studying them in winter in Texas, they use the burrows of crabs, where crabs are creating burrows. They will go in and they might open it up some more, but they're certainly taking advantage of a crab burrow that's abandoned. Obviously, they don't want the crab in there at the same time.
Combining a couple of questions about the mice you were using, does it matter what kind of mice you're feeding because of potential parasites, disease, or only lab mice? And did you ever test any of the trapped mice for rodenticides?
We did not check for rodenticides. There was a study in Texas in the winter, but it didn't find any high levels of rodenticides in the cotton fields. The mice that we're using, you have to sit down to hear the answer to this, are produced by the mouse man. So the mouse man is a very industrious gentleman in Medicine Hat, Alberta, Canada, who captive breeds mice and then euthanizes them quite humanely using CO2 and ships them around North America for the pet trade. So if you want to buy a box of 100 lab mice, you write to the mouse man and make the arrangements. So most or virtually all of the mice that we fed and are still being fed in Grasslands Park come from the mouse man. It's just too time consuming to try to have your own colony and breed them. So as a consequence, the lab mice are white, but the owls don't seem to be worried about not getting brown ones. We debate whether we should, put food coloring and turn them brown or something, but the owls very quickly accepted white food versus brown food, and away they went. So it was an unpaid advertisement for the mouse man in Medicine Hat.
Are there any unintended consequences for regular supplemental food deliveries to the burrowing owls?
There could be. If you remember, there were 2 years where we tried it and then it didn't continue. One of the catches there was the volunteers who were doing the feeding didn't always know which was the right burrow in a prairie dog colony. So they were feeding the wrong burrow. And then whether that was the only cause or simply having the mice near the surface of the burrow, magpies and ravens caught on to the free food. So subsequently, the mice are put 2 feet or more down the burrow with long tweezers. Basically, they're the kind of tweezers one uses to catch a rattlesnake by the head and move it out of the way without having to grab it by hand. So you use that and put a good 2 feet down the burrow so the mice are not visible on top. There's always the risk that another predator might come across the mice, but the owls are already down there, so there's already a food supply. So we've no indication, and certainly in the last 5 years, we have no indication that badgers are catching on and it's increasing predation or anything like that by having the mice in the burrows. I should repeat, because a friend quizzed me yesterday. So by providing mice, we're not totally providing all the food that the young require. We're roughly coming close to half. So the male still has to go foraging. And I guess I should have explained. So the first 3 weeks, the female stays down in the burrow to keep the young warm. So they are not able to thermoregulate. So she has to keep them warm like any other raptor nest. The female stays on the nest and the male brings the food. So it's the male's job now to, when 9 eggs hatch, to feed 9 young plus the female for 3 weeks. And that's the crunch time. So that's what the supplemental food is doing. We're providing about half of that food. He still has to go and forage for the other half, and he seems to be able to do that. So we don't feel, as my friend yesterday said, we're not creating lazy burrowing owls that simply lie at the entrance to their burrow waiting for food to drop on their lap, having tequilas or whatever. They're still working hard. We're just helping save the young.
Are there any volunteer positions available to assist with supplemental feeding or counting nests in the USA?
What my suggestion there is that the folks listening create the volunteer program. So what I'm hoping will come from this, and hopefully we'll get some articles written soon, is that nonprofit groups or just individuals will take it upon themselves to get a pile of mice so they're ready in the spring, find a burrowing owl nest, maybe read a bit of literature to determine the best time to feed them. So in Grasslands Park, the average hatch date is the middle of June, June 15th. So that means half of the young are already hatched. So what we're recommending in Grasslands Park is feeding start June 1st, and that will catch the start of hatching for most of the owls, and then continue for 4 weeks as a minimum. So what I'm hoping is that nonprofit groups, I'm not sure what groups you have in the U.S., Junior Forest Wardens, Boy Scouts, any of the rural groups that, I don't know if you have 4-H, that's a farmers group down there, will take on projects like this where they know they have burrowing owls, have a stockpile of mice ready to go so they're not scrambling when they discovered an owl nest, and then get volunteers to feed them twice a week. And throughout the month of June, or if you're further south, it might need to be a bit earlier. That owl that was trapped with a young in Arizona was at the end of April. So, if you're down that far south, you probably need to start feeding in middle of April and into May. So geographically, you'd have to step it up. But so, yeah, I don't know of any programs being done in the US, but I'm hoping that certainly for Montana, the Dakotas, Wyoming, that supplemental feeding projects will start. And the best way to start them is through a nonprofit group, the Audubon Society, a 4-H, whatever.
So Troy Wellicombe has a couple comments for you. So he said, thanks very much for all the mentoring you and Helen did for me and others in Canada working on burrowing owls. And thanks for the amazing conservation work that you've done throughout the years in Mexico and southern USA. You mentioned a 50% decrease in nestlings between eggs and fledging. Can you confirm if about 25% is from nests that completely fail, which is not alleviated by feeding, and about 25% of that is from starvation of owlets, which can be alleviated by feeding?
Off the top of my head, I can't split it apart. So if Troy's putting those forward, I suspect that's true. I believe what Troy says. So certainly we know there's about 25% nest mortality. And then I've shown you the data on brood reduction. So I would believe Troy.
Did you want to just continue with Troy's comments, Carla?
I didn't see the rest. You can grab some more.
Oh, okay. It says one of the main reasons that owls on the Canadian breeding grounds don't get quite enough food in some years is that extra rain during the nesting period appears to make it too hard for burrowing owls to hunt for mice. But when the weather is good, they seem to be able to find enough mice to eat without trouble. Extreme rain events during the breeding season appears to be linked to climate change.
Yep, no, and I would agree with that. I don't know any data showing the frequency of rain events, but certainly we know from other species, peregrine falcons, tree swallows cannot survive more than about 3 days of cold, wet weather. What I haven't seen is whether that type of weather is more frequent now than it used to be, and just how frequent it is. But certainly we had examples in our studies in Grasslands Park. We had what's called a microburst. So where a thunderstorm's coming along and then it's not quite a tornado, but there's a mini burst. And we actually found a burrowing owl flattened into the mud. So the hail and the rain came down so severely, she was outside the burrow. She just got pounded into the mud, was dead from the impact. And the shrubbery along the creek there had no leaves on it. So it was almost like caterpillars had eaten every leaf. That's how intense the microburst of hail and rain was. So certainly that's more than just a wet season. And there's probably a trade-off, because if it's super dry, then the insects and mice have a tough time too. So there's a trade-off between it being too wet and too dry. And the too wet, I think as Troy said, if it's a period of days, like 3 days of cold, wet weather, then it's very difficult for birds to forage and survive and keep their young warm. The burrowing owls have a slight advantage in that the young are underground, so they're not as susceptible to air temperature. But if they're foraging for insects or even for mice and it's raining, then they're going to have a tougher time to get food.
This is from someone in Aruba. How long do owls live and how long do they reproduce and lay eggs? In Aruba, it's fairly difficult to do supplemental feeding with dead mice. How about chicken gizzards? Also, the ants really attack the chicken gizzards when doing supplementary feeding.
Yeah, so on the last point, that is a tough one. We're lucky in Alberta where we don't have red ants and fire ants, whatever they're called, in the southern US. I don't know what there's on Aruba. So there you do have a problem with ants. And what you may have to do there is try feeding them less food more frequently to try and supplemental feed. Or if you can, I'm not sure. It's hard for me to guess at what might work, whether you could create a mini food platform that's got something around the bottom of it and the owls just, use it as a perch, and then you put a food item up there and they take it down. But that would be pretty manpower intensive. And having answered that part, I forgot the first part of the question.
The first part was, how long do the owls live and how long do they reproduce and lay eggs?
Okay, so we don't really know. In fact, if Troy's on the call, he may know what the record is. I think the record is about 8 years. I'm not sure if we got to 10 years, but that would be the record. I think they're relatively short-lived, and that's why they tend to have a lot of eggs. That usually indicates a species that's short-lived. If you compare that to whooping cranes that are very long-lived and only have 1 or 2 eggs. So generally the number of eggs is related to their lifespan. So probably 2 to 4 years is the most an owl can expect to live and reproduce.
What do you think the reason is for the shorter northbound flights? And do you think the short stop effect could mean more burrowing owls to help population in the U.S.?
Well, the reason is that the owls are not programmed in a high degree to come back to where they were raised or where they were bred the previous year. So their fidelity is low. And I think if one looks at the pattern on the Great Plains, you have wet areas and dry areas. You have storms that we talked about and not. So the distribution of good and bad breeding geographically is going to vary from year to year. So it makes sense that if an area had a lot of food, say the Canadian Great Plains had a lot of food and high productivity one year, and the southern US had low productivity, to me, it makes sense that, without any data, makes sense that the species has low fidelity. They spread out the following year because they don't know if the next year there's going to be better conditions in the southern US and worse in the north. So that and there are many other species that do this. pintail are known to start north and simply stop wherever they find good wetlands. And if they don't find good wetlands, they actually continue north into the boreal forest in Canada, where there are permanent wetlands, but where they have very low nest success. So the food supply is much poorer for them. So that's sort of a dramatic example of a prairie species coming north, stopping wherever there's good food and good habitat, and then staying and not going further. So that's what I feel is happening with burrowing owls. They have low genetic fidelity to come back to a specific area. Obviously, some adults do, 30% do, but the dispersal is quite high. There's many other species that do this. The saw-whet owls do the same thing. They're very low fidelity in studies of nesting saw-whet owls from one year to the next. They don't return to areas where they were produced. So there's lots of other species that have high dispersal.
Can you talk a bit about aging of owls and ultraviolet light techniques for determining age?
I haven't used ultraviolet. That could work. What we find is that we haven't published this, it's still sitting on my desk, my bad, is when the owls, so I'll start again. So the underwing of the owls has alternating dark and light bands. And so when the nestlings grow, those appear as continuous rows. Okay, when the birds molt, they molt single feathers on each side in sequence. So those feathers are growing all different times. They never become, we don't believe they become flightless, although there isn't good data on that, but they probably don't become totally flightless. So they're growing those primaries and secondaries in sequence. So what tends to happen is the bands of dark and light are staggered. They're not in a straight line. And then subsequent to that, in subsequent years, they all look the same, right? They're all going to be staggered. But in the spring, you can tell a one-year-old owl that's still got its flight feathers from subsequent owls from that staggering. So I have a manuscript sitting on my computer, needs to get published instead of giving talks.
So do you know, is it like 2 years to replace all flight feathers, or
no, every
3?
every year they replace them all. So it's not like the big owls that you're familiar with that will, keep some of the natal feathers for 2, 3, 4 years. They replace all the feathers every year. So that in that way, the black lighting doesn't really work as well because you don't get the alternating pattern. Right, all the feathers are 1 year old, regardless in the spring, or 10 months old, whatever. So I think the black light wouldn't work. So the other option then is to look at the pattern of the banding, which isn't a straight line, as I said, for after hatcher birds.
So several people have asked very similar questions about how supplemental feeding seems unrealistic in the long term, and what steps have you been taking to improve habitat for the natural food supplies, things like that.
So in the long term, this comes up frequently, and in fact was a reason that Grasslands Park didn't glom onto it earlier until Stefano arrived. So I would simply throw that back and say, if we were discussing the disappearance of purple martins, because we've cut down all the large forests and we've discovered that they would nest in artificial nest boxes, and we now need to put 1 or 2 million of those over North America to save the species and do that forever, that's impossible and we can't possibly do it. And in fact, that's what happens, right? Purple Martin Conservation Association, lots of volunteers do it. The same for tree swallows, the same for bluebirds. Another example of human intervention to save a species are kiwis in New Zealand. So humans introduced weasels there. The weasels kill the eggs or the small young. So the New Zealand Wildlife Authority gathers up the eggs, incubates them, raises the young until they're 6 months old, and then release them into the wild when they're old enough to avoid predation by weasels. And if they want kiwis 1,000 years from now, unless they can get rid of the weasels, they're going to have to do that for the next 1,000 years. So I think the fact that we haven't found a permanent solution, rather it's an operational one that's going to happen year after year, doesn't mean it's not viable. In order to change the landscape to benefit burrowing owls, that means more systematic changes to the way we manage the prairies. It means less cultivation and more grazing. Possibly some of the large-scale bison ranching that's starting to happen might recreate the conditions that would allow burrowing owls to have enough food, because bison reestablish a lot of the variables in their landscape just from their grazing patterns, from their droppings, etc., their furs. So they have a huge ecological impact on the landscape. So possibly going back to bison grazing and having it over a large enough landscape that bison can move the way they did historically might create the patchwork of habitats that would benefit insects and microteens that would ultimately benefit owls. That remains to be seen. But in the interim, if you want to keep burrowing owls on the landscape, certainly in the northern Great Plains, we've got a supplemental feed. And as I mentioned, I don't think we have to supplemental feed every nest. We probably need to supplemental feed 10 or 20% of the nests over the whole landscape to do that. And that doesn't mean you got to find 10 nests and only do one of them. You supplemental feed every nest you find and assume that you're, finding on a portion of the ones that are in a given landscape.
Just a note back on the UV technique. So Tristan from the Scottish Owl Center said that Lauren at the British Columbia or the BC Burrowing Owl Project says it doesn't work on the species anyway, but he's going to try it with their captive owls at the Scottish Owl Center anyway, just for fun.
Sure.
Question, why do a lot of the owls you put trackers on go to Baja at least once?
Well, only one did, although the veterinarian that lives there sees an influx of burrowing owls in the winter. I might guess that more of those are from California, maybe Oregon, Washington, BC, than are Great Plains owls crossing the mountain ranges. So why they do that, I don't know. Why do birds migrate anywhere? I mean, there is suitable habitat in Baja. It's not a lush landscape, but it's still wild landscape. Why this one owl decided to do, I mean, it wasn't even a straight line from Alberta to Baja. It was an abrupt right turn in New Mexico. So who knows why it did that? I can't even hazard a guess.
I think the folks the owls in Baja must be doing some good marketing somewhere. Ran across some good advertisement or travel deals.
Right, could be. I mean, maybe they talked to some Canadian snowbirds that went down there from Alberta and Saskatchewan and decided to try it. Who knows?
Along with marketing, that actually transitions very nicely into the next question. Should we say that hunger is a problem that plagues owls? Would that make for more sympathy and more funding for work owls?
Sure. I mean, it's not just hunger, it's starvation, right? Troy's research shows that some years, half the young starve to death in the first 3 weeks. So yeah, what wouldn't gain more empathy than the view of a tiny nestling hatching out and then not being fed? And in fact, Troy and some of our other co-workers, Ray Pula and Danielle Todd, actually had photographs of the neighbors coming over and stealing young and feeding them to their young. So cannibalism. And that certainly almost certainly happens within the nest. If you're a mom and you've got 9 young and you've only got enough food for 3 of them, it's like, sorry guys that were last to hatch, but you're now food for your siblings. So yeah, sure. I mean, whatever it takes to motivate people to either donate or to actually take action and implement a project.
Someone asked, have you considered feeding grasshoppers instead of mice?
I haven't. If someone has a supply of grasshoppers that they can provide the gram equivalent of 13 mice twice a week, that would be worth trying. It might be a bit messier, but yeah, I mean, I just don't know where you get them from.
This person talks about natal recruitment. You said that recruitment of 6% was low. In their population of tawny owls, they also have 6%. I think Newton mentions about 6% for sparrowhawks.
Right. So and to me, that what it means is that there's very high natal dispersal. So the young are going elsewhere in subsequent years. Some will die, but it doesn't mean that 94% are dead. It just means that they're dispersing. And, you know, we can go into a whole discussion about the reasons for dispersing or not dispersing, the genetic ones as well as the habitat ones that I talked about. But there's lots of reasons that critters disperse, and you know, we're bipedal and stuck in our study area, so they don't have to disperse very far, and we don't find them. So it just becomes a blank as to what happens to a bird if we don't find it again. Oh, we can't hear you, Carla.
I was just humming while I was deciding which one I was going to
Oh,
pick.
sorry.
We're getting through these. So the females don't do the cuckoo call, is that correct?
Well, you know, if Troy's on the call or other burrowing owl researchers, I don't remember a female where I knew it was a female calling, you know, responding to the playback. It was always the male. There was one instance where a female followed me along a road for about 5 kilometers. I was stopping every half kilometer, and I could see her in the twilight flying down the fence line, but I don't really remember her calling back at me. Now, I might be wrong, so I'll let Troy or anyone else who's on the call correct me whether she was calling back to me or not. I just don't remember her. I remember watching her.
Okay, because the person had asked if there's a pitch difference between sexes, but if they do similar calls, can you tell? I mean, because they do other calls also. Can you tell a male from a female pitch-wise in other calls?
Yeah, I just don't remember a female calling, so I'm afraid I have no data for that.
Troy says, I don't think the females hoot like the males do during breeding season, but both sexes give the alarm call.
Right, for sure they both give the alarm call. So thanks, Troy. It wasn't just my memory fading. It is true.
He also says it would be interesting to know whether the burrowing owls in Aruba replace all their tail and flight feathers every year like the ones in Western North America.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Yeah, I didn't talk about it in this talk, but I did a study. I went twice to Isla Clarion, which is an island 1,000 kilometers west of Manzanillo, so out in the Pacific Ocean, owned by Mexico. And the owls that we trapped there had similar patterns to Western burrowing owls. It looked like their wing and tail feathers all molted each year. We didn't find any age difference like we do in saw-whet owls, where they tend to replace only about 1/3 of their feathers.
We're running low on questions. We're getting through most of these. Somebody asked how many people are watching today. And I can't tell you for sure because we have to get the YouTube numbers put in with the Zoom numbers, and then some people pop in and pop out, but I think somewhere around 250 people are watching live. And we had people from, when I checked this morning, which was before everybody had signed up, we had people from 10 countries and 30 US states that had registered. So people, of course, can watch on YouTube without having registered also. So we do get quite a few people coming in from all over the place, and fantastic to see we have people from Venezuela and Aruba checking in also. It's always fun to see what's going on in other countries with the same species.
Well, and it makes these talks really worthwhile. It's one plus to the pandemic that it's allowed us to pioneer these frontiers and give these webinars that spread everywhere. I could also, as you know, you're recording this, so in fact the recording will be available afterwards too, so people can listen to it if they missed it. And I know I've got a bad habit of that. I'll sign up for a webinar knowing I'm busy, but also knowing that I'll then hear where the recording is so I can listen for it afterwards.
And speaking of saved recordings, David Johnson did a presentation on burrowing owls. When was it? For one of our International Owl Awareness Days, I think. So you can find that presentation on the International Owl Center's YouTube channel. I think we moved it over so it was under the playlist for the Virtual Owl Expert Speaker Series. So he was focusing on owls in Oregon. So they're doing some different things than what you're seeing in your location.
Right. Yeah, much less severe winters. So the owls have different environments to cope with.
So I think his females would go to California and the males went north to Washington State so that they would be closer to the burrows because it was all about getting back to the best hole first.
Right. And without having heard the talk, I would guess that if they went north, they're probably going to lower elevation sites where there's more prey available. But I'll be interested in listening to the talk.
Sorry, I'm trying to find the link so I can post it in chat. Question is, do burrowing owls cache food while raising chicks?
Yes, for sure. And Troy has the best data on that because he was studying the owls in chambers that he had excavated. And likewise, Ray Poulin and Daniel Todd. And I don't remember their record, but 50 or more mice cache down on a nest when there's a good mouse here. So one should remember that the burrow is cold underground. It can be 1 to 3 or 4 feet underground. So it's not, so any mice that are cached are in some form of a cooler. It's not necessarily refrigerator cold, although probably the start of the season it is. Yeah, they definitely take mice and other food and store them underground.
Do you speak Spanish when you work in Mexico? And they also said it's a novel idea for supplemental feeding, or do you know of other projects that incorporate supplemental feeding?
There have been other research projects that incorporate supplemental feeding and found similar results. Speaking Spanish, it's somewhat embarrassing. The first couple of years I went to Mexico, I was on my own, and I took night courses back here trying to learn Spanish. And then fortunately was able to have Helen Treffry work with me. And Helen learned Spanish in her spare time before starting burrowing owls in Mexico. And so first trip, I'll never forget going down there, and the first couple of conversations, I tried to take the lead because I'm the one that had been down there before, right? And maybe because I'm the guy and she's not. And after the second conversation, she said, you know, about half the words you used were French and they don't really understand what you're saying. So if I could suggest the next time, you just keep quiet and listen. It may not have been that blunt, but it was pretty blunt. And that's what we did. So I struggled to keep up with the conversation, but Helen was the main linguist. But then we also hooked up with a variety of Mexican residents who were bilingual. One couple in particular, Ruth and Vaughn Peacock, who were expat Americans that actually moved to Mexico and were fluent. And so that whenever we were traveling with them, he would take the lead because he was just so fluent in Spanish that we wouldn't even try. So the bottom line is, no, I don't speak Spanish. I can get in and out of an airport and in and out of a restaurant. I can find out where the baño is, but after that, I'm sort of limited, sadly.
Okay, just because I saw your presentation, I think it was at your presentation in the Netherlands back in 2007, you had this fantastic, insane story about landing the airplane someplace and being surrounded by guys with guns. Does this ring a bell? You have to tell that story.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said when I showed the slide of Colima, so we were flying back towards Puebla. Remember I talked about the volcano. So we'd been to Guadalajara. We're doing a transect back towards Puebla. And so the scenario is there's a pilot, obviously. In this case, I was in the co-pilot seat. Helen's got the headset on in the back seat listening to static, which by the way, we figure we hold the world's record for listening to static at 8,000 feet, right? Like, it's not like a headset where you're listening to music on your jet to somewhere warm. We're listening to static, hoping to hear a beep, beep, beep. But in the meantime, it's just 4 hours of static and we switch shifts. So I'm in the front seat and I follow along with maps. We had aeronautical maps that showed all the airplane information. And we flew over this paved runway. And so I said to Tom, that's interesting, Tom. There's a paved runway down there. It's not on the map. Like, I wonder why it's there. So about 10 minutes later, Tom's on the radio talking to Puebla. And as I said, I know enough Spanish, I can kind of follow along. And he's declaring an emergency. And I look at the dashboard and our temperature gauge is maxed out. It's redlined. So the temperatures on the engine is redlined. He's calling the airport. And then he says to Helen and I, remember that airport you just saw? I'm turning now. He said, it's not dangerous. If the engine quits, it's close enough we can glide. I'm good at gliding these things. He'd been flying airplanes for over 50 years. And the plane's over 50 years old, I used to joke. Anyway, he turned the plane around and we saw the runway ahead and he was comforting us. We can land there, we can land there, no worries. Of course, the engine never did quit, but he landed right off. He didn't do any checking out the airport or anything. Obviously, we just wanted to get on the ground. Pulled up to the big air hangar. So the apron was pulled off the runway. And as he pulled off and turned the engine, the hangar doors opened and it felt like half the Mexican army ran out with machine guns on the level. Now, I'm sure there weren't that many there, but there were probably a good 20 or so. And then this general walked out, puffed up and doing his thing once his troops had secured this airplane. And the troops all turned with their guns away from us. So we never felt threatened. They were effectively waiting for drug smugglers to turn up to meet this airplane, because this airport was not a designated airport. Drug runners had created it, and they were stalking it out, waiting for drug runners. So we explained our circumstances, that we had, at this point, we had government passports, which are different than diplomatic, but different from our regular passports. So they have some significance. And we explained the engine situation, and they checked out. They were very thorough. They were very polite, checked out the plane, make sure there was no hidden compartments of drugs. And then Helen and I got out and chatted with this general while our pilot checked out the plane with the mechanic that the Army had with them. And this general had been to Canada and toured Canada with General de Chastelain, whom I've never met, but he was very proud to tell us that he had toured our air bases and learned a lot about air bases and passed on some things that they do while our plane was being checked out. And then Tom said, well, I think we can make it to Puebla, but if you don't want to get on the plane, I understand. So of course we got on the plane, flew to Puebla with no incident. We spent 2 days there while they replaced the thermostat and checked out the engine, decided it was the thermostat. We then go north. 2 or 3 days later, we're approaching the US border, and our flight plan is to land at I believe it was Matamoros. And I looked over and I said, Tom, the engine's redlined again. So he phoned, and I'd have to look up the US cities right on the border there, but he declared an emergency, did a right turn, and just crossed the border and landed in the US. And we had this very obnoxious American border official come up, say we crossed the border illegally, we had not filed a flight plan, he could throw us in jail and throw the key away. He was just, in contrast to the Mexicans that had real reason to think we were drug runners, the US authority was pretty obnoxious. Anyway, we finally cleared that up and flew back to Corpus Christi and to Rockport and made it home.
And this should make everybody want to be an owl researcher, because you can have grand adventures while being an owl researcher.
Yeah, it was pretty. Someday I've got to write us all up, but
I think we have gotten through most of the questions. There's one that kind of relates to some of what we've talked about before. As far as Great Salt Lake, Utah, any insights about the health of the population there? And if healthy, can that population be helpful to the Canadian population?
And I just don't. In fact, I don't even know of anyone that's studied them there. I don't remember a study out of Utah. So I'm afraid I don't know.
Okay. Yay. I think we got through everything.
Great.
Amazing.
Well done.
All right. So thank you, Geoff, very much for doing this. This is fantastic. I personally love learning all this stuff. And it's fantastic for our staff at the Owl Center. But what's really awesome is that we can share it with so many people around the world and other people who are working with burrowing owls, other people who are teaching people about burrowing owls, people who rehab burrowing owls, and the general public who just wants to learn what they can do to help owls and to know more about owls. So thank you very much for doing that. And thanks to all of you who are watching and learning, because the more of us knowing more about owls, the better we can make the world a better place for owls. And thanks to all of you specifically who donated to help support this series, to keep it free so anybody can watch it, and we can save the presentations and more people can learn even after we're done.
Well, thank you, Carla, for setting this up, and for you and Joe to do some of the behind the scenes work and do the questions. And yeah, I'd like to thank everyone else for joining in and spending at least for those of us in North America, the middle of their day listening about burrowing owls, and hopefully they can get outside. I'm going to put my skis on and go skiing right after this, so don't forget to enjoy the nature that we're all interested in watching.
Yeah, and so next week we're going to have Dr. Erkki Korpamaki from Finland, and his presentation is going to be living in a variable environment, boreal and pygmy owls in the high amplitude population cycle of voles in Northern Europe. So you can either sign up as you have been. If you haven't signed up for the Owl Center's e-newsletter, you might want to consider doing that, because we send those out with every one of these programs. So Facebook is not always great about making sure everything gets into your feeds. I don't always remember to get it on every listserv. So the most reliable way is either watching our website or signing up for our e-newsletter to continue with these. And we'll continue them most Sundays through the end of February. So we've got 2 dates we're filling in yet. I'm excited to say we are going to have a spotted owl one this year. In addition to some other ones that are already on the schedule, we're just working on the date for the spotted owl one.
Great. If I could add to when folks are watching Dr. Korpamaki's talk, he actually has data on vole abundance, mice and vole abundance, whereas on the Great Plains we don't, that I'm aware of. So when folks are listening to that, think about fluctuating microteam populations on the prairies and what we've talked about on burrowing owls, and how the same system likely applies.
Okay. Thanks very much. And we hope to see a whole bunch of you next week. Enjoy your ski, Geoff.
Thank you. Take care. Have a good day.
Bye, everybody.